Hi, I'm Brian with BibleStudying.net, and so far we've covered a lot of different religions, and lastly I want to cover some ones that are sort of recent re-emergences, as you will, or attempts to recreate ancient paganism or Druidry, the cult, witchcraft, and also want to include the New Age in this because of its relationship as a more recent phenomenon. So let's talk about some of these in terms of what we know historically. According to Britannica, they talk about neo-paganism, and they say any of several spiritual movements that attempts to revive the ancient polytheistic religions of Europe and the Middle East. These movements, these modern movements, have a close relationship to ritual magic and modern witchcraft. Neo-paganism differs from them, however, because it strives to revive authentic pantheons and rituals in ancient cultures, though it is often deliberately eclectic. What do you mean by eclectic? It means selecting or choosing from various sources, chosen because of the fancied appropriateness of the material. So in other words, they're sort of hand-picking this based on what they like. And then it says also, often done in reconstructionist ways, the personification of nature is full of divine life. So you notice the personification of nature here is full of divine life. There's a pantheistic concept there as well as polytheism involved. So this is an attempt effectively to revive the ancient Western version of the global pantheistic, polytheistic mysticism. Although the religious practices are attempts to revive ancient religions, effectively what we have here is simply 19th century, 20th century attempts to revive or reconstruct these. According to the Columbia Encyclopedia, two of the movement's most influential thinkers were Alphonse L. Constant in 1810 to 1875 and Gerard Nicasse 1865 to 1916. So again, 19th, 20th century figures. Britannica says similarly concerning this in terms of neo-paganism. It says it has its roots in the 19th century Romanticism. It says contemporary neo-paganism is for the most part a product of the 1960s, influenced by Carl Jung and writer Robert Graves. So these are attempts to reconstruct these things, although the information that it's based on, what we know, is very difficult, and sometimes these are very highly selective. And similarly, the New Age movement, from Britannica, it says that the movement spread through the occult and metaphysical religious communities in the 1970s and 80s. The movement's strongest supporters were followers of modern esotericism, a religious perspective that is based on the acquisition of mystical knowledge, and that has been popular in the West since the 2nd century AD, especially in the form of Gnosticism. So the New Age movement is effectively Gnosticism or mysticism in a very modern sense, but it's part of that same global kind of group of religious mysticism. According to Britannica and its origins, in the late 19th century, someone by the name of Helena Blavatsky, who's the co-founder of the Theosophical Society, announced the coming of a new age. So this too is a modern attempt to effectively revive something ancient. In this sense, Gnosticism, but in the other sense, paganism and witchcraft. They're sort of attempting to reconstruct these things in modern terms. And it doesn't present us with new religions to consider because there are attempts to revive effectively the pantheistic, polytheistic worldview as it existed in Europe and in the West. So we're not adding something that'll be something we can analyze and just sort of categorize it with the global pantheistic, polytheistic, mystical religion that's out there competing effectively with Jewish monotheism and Islam as well. And so let's sort of take the moments here at the end of this particular segment to talk about what we've seen so far in terms of this larger question. The large question being, how do you determine which religion is correct? We've started to see some evidence that we don't have a myriad of many, many religions that we have to go in and go, boy, we have so much to look at, how can we possibly determine between all these religions? What we've seen is that we're finding that there's really only a handful of religions out there that we're going to have to do this kind of work with. There's effectively only a handful of different perspectives on certain essential questions about God, about salvation, about sin, about morality, about where mankind came from. And those types of questions, there's only really a few different points of view, because the large-scale polytheistic, pantheistic, mystical religions of Europe that spread all the way over on the other side to the Far East, those are really the same religion. And in the next segment of this video series, we're going to look at their doctrines, specifically the 4 essential points of that, and demonstrate that to be the case. So we're really only comparing a few religions. Now, in addition to that, on the historical level, the question is, why should we believe this religion or that religion? Or how would we know which religion's claim, if any, is true? And what we've seen is that in a situation where we know that something divine exists, something beyond the universe, a personal being that created the universe, as we've established in earlier video series, if that's the case, then we're simply looking at the various different concepts or descriptions of that divine being that are offered over the course of human history. And we can then corroborate this historical figure, that is the divine being himself, and what is revealed about him in the same way we would any other event or figure in history. And when it comes to that particular process, we've seen that Christianity in particular, but also ancient Judaism, hands down have not only better historical documentation than any other religion, but than any other ancient historical figure, event, secular or otherwise. That we have more documentation on which to reconstruct that testifies to the existence of Christianity in particular and the events described in the New Testament Christian historical documents than anything else in ancient history, including Plato, including Alexander the Great, including the Caesars, including any of this stuff. We know Christianity from historical documentation is true so much more than we would be able to say so about any of those others. If we just look at the amount of evidence that we have in terms of the manuscript evidence and the archaeology and compare those two together. And so from a perspective of someone who approaches religion objectively, who says, I want to determine all the decisions of my life based upon reason, based upon evidence, on an empirical approach to what's going on, if that's your approach that you take, and I argue that it should, and we have a video series on epistemology that makes the argument for approaching religion and your worldview that way, just like you would any other decision in your life, going to the doctor, business decisions, career decisions, how to handle situations with your kids, any situation in your life you handle based upon experience, objective evidence, and reason. And if you want to be a sane person who applies the same standard rather than a double standard, you should be approaching religion that way as well. And if you do, what you'll find is that Christianity, and which is just a sect of Judaism, has the best attestation historically, the most evidence historically, just in terms of its written documentation, than any other religion. And we'll talk more about this idea of corroboration in the next video series and how Christianity is really hands down above and beyond all the others in that regard as well. So we're putting forth here essentially an argument for why Christianity as a Jewish religion is superior simply if you're analyzing religion on an objective, empirical, reasonable level. And if you are, you should be concluding that the evidence favors Judeo-Christianity. So I'm going to stop this video here. We're going to come back and we're going to have another segment of this video that's going to deal with establishing, in fact, that there is such a thing as a global polytheistic, pantheistic, mystical religion that are essentially, in its various forms, simply denominations. Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, just a few examples of denominations of that worldview. And we want to look at that and establish that by comparing the particular doctrines. And we'll come back in just a moment and take a look at that evidence.